Hello and welcome to the first episode of The Good Life with me, Sabine Pusch.
And me, Robert Keeling.
Brilliant. Now, Robert, tell me, what is this? It's called The Good Life, and it sounds great. I love The Good Life, but it does immediately make me think of Penelope Keith in Wellies, in suburban England, which our German listeners won't understand at all, but our British ones will. So tell me, what is this all about?
Well, the good life is a kind of philosophical concept, I guess, which is something everybody wants. And people have been thinking about this question thousands of years. And cities offer people a good life. They offer economic opportunities, social opportunities, cultural opportunities. But I think particularly as the world has changed since COVID and continues to change for the worse, but also for the better, hopefully, we should really be thinking about how do cities, and a city that I live in, London, and a city that I love and know, Berlin, what does a good life mean in both of those places?
How do you make society work better and have people stay involved in society? Is that what you mean? Because it can be quite fractured, can't it?
Exactly. And it's easy to carve out your own good life as a bit of an island in those cities. But I think most people would accept that if we have to live with often large numbers of people in big cities. London is pushing towards 10 million people. Berlin is something like 3.5 million people. They're very different cities, very different histories. That goes without saying. But I think there's things that whenever I go to Berlin, there are just bits of Berlin which I think if only there was a bit more of this in London, and sometimes the other way around. So it's kind of that's where I think this is coming from.
So give me an example of something you've seen in Berlin that you think would work well in London.
I think the obvious thing has got to be the natural environment. Berlin is just such a green city. I think the statistics show that London is actually a greener city, I think the greenest in Europe. And anybody who's flown over London will just see it as a kind of canopy of green. Berlin is just unique. It has lakes, beautiful lakes, real sort of selling point, I think, for Berlin. And lots of green space. I sometimes wonder in Berlin, it has it's slightly less dense than London, but some of the thought that's got into housing, whether it's public housing or private housing, and city planning, I think there are bits that London could learn from that. And there are some bits which just wouldn't work in London. Berlin is very much a product of its often pretty difficult history. It's experienced a lot of ruptures in its history, where it's had to start again. And by that, I don't just mean the Second World War, but over all of its 700-year-old history. And London, of course, was built from scratch after the Great Fire of London, and has also been through a series of sort of changes.
Yeah, I mean, London's sort of evolved, hasn't it? That's part of the thing I like about it. It's like a group of villages that have all amalgamated together, and in between are these amazing parks, which is something that London has got that so many other European cities don't. And when I think of places like Barcelona or Paris, they have much less sort of open green spaces, don't they?
Absolutely. From a community aspect, London is really lucky because a lot of people get involved with their parks, and there are lots of friends of parks, even cemeteries, which are often overgrown and become natural assets in their own right.
I've planted trees at the local park and helped out. Yeah.
And that can be a really nice way if people feel a bit involved with things. Berlin also has that. I think there's an interesting relationship, slightly different relationship between kind of local government and voluntary groups in places like Berlin as opposed to London. It's kind of more normal for people, if they have the time to get involved with community projects in London in a way which is a bit different in Berlin. It's less common for basically the state, whether that's local, regional or national, to see it as an obvious way to do stuff. And that really, that's at the nub of a bit of a broader question, which I'm very interested in, which is how do we engage people in cities like Berlin and London, and perhaps with lessons that extend to other cities around the world.
What do you mean by engage? Engage in what way?
So get people involved. I mean, it is possible in cities to live in complete isolation, whether that's voluntary or maybe it's not voluntary. People in cities who by necessity are surrounded by a lot of fellow citizens. This has been a conundrum which politicians and philosophers have grappled with for centuries, is how do you involve large groups of people without succumbing to perhaps sort of the lowest common denominator and just doing things which everybody wants. And populism is of course, in the last 10 years or so, big subject, which I think is an interesting one.
So let's explain what populism is. So it's sort of almost like a misnomer, isn't it? Populism.
It's certainly a pretty loosely used word, and in its purest sense, it is of course a good thing. People should have be the subject of policies which are genuinely popular.
Yeah, but I mean, the ultimate populist was obviously Adolf Hitler, wasn't he? Let's be honest.
Yeah, and had visions of the good life in Berlin, which were twisted. Berlin is a profoundly scarred city. Anybody who's even been there briefly will just see how it's a unique blend of, in the East, huge Soviet era planning. The Nazi legacy is there for everybody to see. Berlin wears its history on its sleeve. It's very good at trying to remember its past. But yes, some of the fantasies that Hitler and the Nazis had about how to create a better life in Germany, still make for uncomfortable thinking. And I think that kind of utopian strand to the good life is something which Berlin has, given that it's a kind of laboratory for ideas as a city. The utopian side, it's shown the worst that can do. And I think that makes for an interesting counterpoint to London, which has had its fair share of dreamers, utopian thinkers who've tried to make it a kind of countryside in the city, or make it a beautiful city.
Also, I mean, I think, I should come clean at this point, and I think we both should, right? I am, although I do sound very English, I am in fact Sabine Pusch und ich bin Deutsch. Ich bin nur hier aufgewachsen. Okay, so we've both got this interesting perspective on things, and I think maybe we should talk about that. So I feel very British in one way, but I also feel like an outsider in Britain and in London. But I think most people are an outsider in London. And I think looking at London from the point of view of being a German, I think it's very interesting, whereas Berlin, which I don't know nearly as well as you do, does bear its history very much on its sleeve. And you go to the Brandenburg Gate and right next door is the Holocaust Memorial, and it is amazing. There is nothing like that in London for Britain's shameful history. And, Britain isn't nearly as good at thinking and facing up to that history. And the face you just made is very interesting, because the British have a really difficult, uncomfortable relationship with the more negative elements of their own history, which I think is also quite interesting, and I think it came out in the Brexit vote and all that. But anyway, I'm blabbing on. But anyway, I've given my little secret of my background. Now you need to also share why you have this interest in Berlin and the link between Berlin and London.
Well, as you know, Sabina, my wife is German, and my children are German speaking, and I've on and off, I think, for the last 20 odd years, have kept going back to Berlin, but also and the rest of Germany, either for personal reasons or just out of deep interest in Germany. And all the stuff you've just said isn't. We should say from the start, this isn't unique to the capitals. London and Berlin do, of course, though, distill all of that, and the ability for iconic major cities, whether they're in Europe or outside of Europe, to be comfortable with their past. And for old, cities that date back to the Romans, like London, cities which are more medieval, like Berlin, the effort that is taken in the public realm to to say, yes, we recognise things have happened throughout this long history, which are at times awful, I think is a mark of confidence in Berlin. That doesn't for any moment suggest that there are comparisons between German and UK history on some of this stuff. But Berlin has made, I think by anybody's standards, an amazing effort to, in the public sphere, not the Holocaust Memorial is one of many very thought-provoking displays of trying to do this. There's a great German word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is trying to come to own the past, or the Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, which is working through the past. I don't think we have words. English is a rich language, but we're not quite as good at these thoughtful words.
And also, I mean, when I go through the centre of London, all I see is men on horses and who've I don't know, conquered various far-flung corners of the world. I don't see anything that reflect. I mean, there's a nice little sculpture, I think, at Waterloo now of Afro-Caribbeans arriving in the UK, which I think is the only one I can think of really that nods to anything like that. Can you think of anything?
No, I mean, I think I've often thought when I'm in Berlin, it is, assuming you're in a relatively thoughtful frame of mind, you are bombarded with historic messages, most of which are sobering ones. There are some which point to a happier times in Berlin's history, but it majors on the tougher stuff through necessity, really. London has a more amnesiac quality to it. This is another interesting counterpoint, I think, between the two places, is that London can have a sense of complacency, perhaps, or overconfidence. I'm sure people outside London feel that occasionally. Berlin has the cliche is that it has a kind of gruff humour and an Unwille, a kind of lack of, a kind of rebelliousness, which I think is true. On the other hand, Berlin is a profoundly thoughtful city, and I think that's a side to German culture which I think is needed ever more and more, given some of the really difficult questions that Germany is wrestling with at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the first time I went to Berlin, I was actually 15 and I was doing German A-level, which is an incredibly lazy thing to do, really. It's one of my A-levels. But at 15, we all jumped in the back of a minibus and drove to Berlin from Rochester in Kent, which is where I was going to school. And I remember so clearly arriving at the border and having to show my passport. I was the only one who had a German passport. And driving down that motorway, and you weren't allowed to stop, and it was dark, and it really did feel like you were in some kind of Le Carre novel. And then arriving in Berlin at the other end, and there was this real kind of the atmosphere of Berlin was quite extraordinary. It had this sort of survival. It's this island. It was this island in the middle of the sea of the East, which this was 1983. That's how old I am. And it was a very, very cold part of the Cold War. And I remember how I felt when I first walked down a road and there was tram lines in the road, and then it just stopped with this wall. It was really shocking to me and really upsetting to me. And then crossing Checkpoint Charlie with the school group and seeing the Soviet soldiers or the East German soldiers goose-stepping. They were goose-stepping. I couldn't believe I was watching goose-stepping in Germany. And that history is still so recent, isn't it? But also there was always this sort of sense in Berlin of this rebellion. That was always an alternative lifestyle. There were the punks. You saw much more punks in Berlin than you did anywhere else in Germany, certainly than you saw in Munich, which is the other place that I used to go to as a kid, or down in Bavaria. And I mean, it's so interesting seeing how that has now changed, and also that whole kind of wall area of Berlin has just been got rid of, and how it's moved forwards. And but with London, going back to London, I think the superpower that London has, I think, is this incredible ability to welcome people of different cultures, and it must be the most multicultural city in the world, in a way that everybody really it does feel like everybody is part of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's the other really interesting comparison between Berlin and London. And again, we're talking about those two cities a lot. I think some of those comparisons apply to lots of other places around the world. London sets the bar very high about what multiculturalism can look like, and the way that people with hundreds of different languages can exist together in one city. It's different in Berlin, I would say. The things that people get upset about are different. I think some of that comes back to the demographics in Berlin are really different. There is a kind of nucleus of English speakers in the kind of trendier central districts, like Prenzlauer Berg is the obvious one, and that there are pockets of one language being spoken, which is often more noticeable in Berlin than it might be in London, where I think it gets a bit more lost in the noise. My personal theory is that Germans are less equipped to deal with how they feel about those things like that, because of its really difficult history, and that Germans have grown up often finding it very hard to articulate what they like about Germany. I remember when I first joined this think tank, I said it was called the German Institute for Good Living. That raised a lot of eyebrows amongst Brits and mainly Germans, who are like, this is uncomfortable having these words together in the same name, which, as somebody who is well aware of the awful sides of German history, but sees parts of German culture which are great, I kind of thought, my gosh, that's overthinking this a little bit. But I think, yeah, definitely there are bits of Berlin where people with the best of intentions are often not comfortable of knowing how to talk about cultures which are not originally German, in a way which maybe there's a bit more fluency and a bit more easiness in London.
I do remember once having a visitor. I think they were actually from the Ukraine rather than from Germany, bizarrely, but it's a long time ago. And they were coming to London and they wanted to stay in an English family. And they went out and walked around the city and enjoyed London. And then they came back and they said to me, "Oh, you have a lot of immigrants in London, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, it depends what you mean, because actually a lot of people that you're seeing with black and brown skin, their parents or grandparents fought for the British in the Second World War, Don't assume these are not British people. They are. And actually, a lot of the immigrants are actually white. At that time, it was pre-Brexit. And they looked at me like I was mad. They just didn't understand that Britishness is not actually quite so associated now, especially now, with colour of your skin, is it?
No, I mean, I think that's, I find it really fascinating what German identity means, and how, Berlin is also, the other thing to say really is that we're in the way that London just dominates the UK in a way which really upsets a lot of people, but is factually true. Berlin is not quite the same, and Germany is polycentric. It has big cities, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Munich, etc., which have their own sort of things that they bring to the rest of the country, if you want to put it like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, every time I go to Bavaria, I always find it very amusing that I cross the border into Bavaria and it says, "Welcome to the Freistaat Bayern." And I remember my father having a story when he was going skiing once, and an Italian pushed in at the front of the queue. And the Bavarian behind him said, "Du Saupreis, du Italiener." Only our German listeners will be able to understand that particular phrase. But yeah, for Bavarian, the biggest insult is to call them a Prussian. So yeah, I think that those sorts of differentials between the different parts of Germany are not well understood in Britain. I always say that the Bavarians are a bit like the Scots of Germany.
And that could, that's a scenario which future podcasts in this series will really try to dig into. It's sort of slightly the preserve of local government nerds in the UK, but as you say, Sabine, in Germany, the constitutional rights of city-states, of the Bundesländer and so on are fiercely protected. And Berlin is, again, a unique city, as with everything else in that regard. It's a state of its own. It's surrounded, the hinterland, Brandenburg, is a very different part of Germany. And recent events over the summer have shown, the former east of Germany is still, there's some real contour lines there, which Berlin is not immune to, but as a capital city, the people are still, I think this is very well-worn territory, but Berlin is not as yet on the kind of forefront of some of that difficult stuff. I'm thinking of the alternative for Germany, obviously. But, the degree to whether that's just, complacency that capital cities often display, if that's really the reason, or whether the AfD have tapped into something about German identity which city types are able to resist. I think that's for German political commentators to dig into a bit, but that's an interesting area. And of course, with London, we had over the summer, it felt like a near miss of really noxious far-right activity, which was storming up and around the rest of the country. And with a few near misses, didn't affect London as much, in fact, hardly at all. And I think that's a bit I'd like in this podcast series to dig into as well, is to try gently to get out of the comfort zone here. I think coming back to the original theme of what the good life means, it's in the 21st century that can mean a kaleidoscope of different things. So the things that traditionally one might think around economic opportunities, the ability to be yourself in a city, the ability to not be subject to peer pressure, to pursue a particular lifestyle and stuff, that is definitely all true. And I'm sure it's still as true for somebody in a bit of neighbourhood in Berlin and a neighbourhood in London. That ability to manifest yourself in a way that is good for you, it is definitely still true. But in the kind of fractured times that we live in at the moment, does the good life mean good for everybody? Good life. There are so many different political narratives, so many different ways of grasping reality, it feels, in the world at the moment. Do cities still offer that kind of anchor, those ideas, or could they be laboratories for even wilder ideas? And this comes back to kind of the original thing we were saying, Berlin has already been a laboratory of wild ideas and has shown history just what that can look like.
But they've also sort of shown how you can learn from it and move on from it, haven't they?
Yeah, no, indeed. So I think, the one thing we're going to be exploring is trying to get away from we'll explore the traditional ideas, what makes for good living. And by that, I mean, not just economic, but housing. Both Berlin and London have very different housing crises. Berlin, it's more about rent, the price of rent and the cost of rent. And London, it's just a supply of housing. I think that they're fairly well-worn areas, but one that I think still need to be discussed. But also, hopefully, we can bring a kind of fresh take on some of these issues as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the good life is an interesting question. I mean, the other day I was out walking the dog and I met a neighbour of mine and we were chatting, and she stopped talking to me, said, "Excuse me," and she turned around and she said something to a lady, an older lady who was walking past wearing a lovely bright pink coat, and she made the effort to say to her, what a lovely coat. Don't you look lovely? I think you look very, very fine today, sort of thing. And I was so impressed by that, because you're saying about everybody can make their own good life, but actually the city can be a very lonely place. And I guess the question is how you bring people in to feel like they're part of a society when they may be living very, very solitary lives. And I think you were saying that your first interest in this series of podcasts is to do with citizens' assemblies, didn't you? And I'd really like you to just explain to me what that means.
Absolutely. I mean, let me just take a short step back first. I mean, as ever, there are good German words for all of this stuff. So a really critical distinction is between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. So Gemeinschaft is more the tighter, the sense of society and community, which perhaps is a bit smothering at times. I'm sure most people have felt that at some point in their lives. And Gesellschaft is the broader, open, kind of positive side to that. So the sort of fracturing you're talking about, where yes, we don't always talk to people when we're walking the dog, is an example of bridging out to other people and making them feel kind of that they're sharing the same space as you are. I think the fascinating area is contrasting that to this Gemeinschaft feel, where people actually move to cities because they want to just be by themselves. But I think the segue there is to citizen assemblies is how do you create the conditions in cities where people can feel listened to in the public realm, ideally in person. The perils of online debate are pretty well understood, I think, by now. And how can we debate the issues which affect either national politics or just affecting cities in a way that's really open and also crucially makes a bit of change. So citizen assemblies are, and we'll be talking in the next podcast with some experts in this. We're going to talk to some UK and German practitioners who've tried to use this technique to debate areas of public interest, but in a way that then brings politicians to account and gets them to commit to changing things. Or, as we'll hear in the Berlin case, listens to voices from people that, for whatever reason, the City Hall or the Senat, as it's called in Berlin, just hasn't listened to. And both of those have their place. These aren't panaceas. They're not going to fix kind of broken democratic trends, which everybody should worry about. But there are lots of pitfalls along the way. It's not clear to me how citizens' assemblies, if done at a big scale, wouldn't be hijacked by people with unpleasant agendas. But how you balance that with actually genuinely having a debate about areas that people really care about, that's also very, very tricky. But as a one key ingredient to good life in cities, as we'll be hearing, both Berlin and London have tried to pave a way on that.
Yeah, I'll be really interested to hear about that. Thank you. Look forward to it.
Great. Auf Wiedersehen und auf Wiederhören.
Auf Wiederhören.